They may be watching you, but I'm watching them. This is Gabriel Custodiet. Just to let you know that the episode you're about to listen to is going to be great, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. If you're new to privacy or looking for a clear vision of next steps, start by going to escapethetechnocracy.com. All our cutting-edge analysis about escaping the surveillance grid occurs exclusively on our paid newsletter, Watchman's Torch, and in our world-class video tutorials. This podcast is just a preview. This is not some game for us. We live this stuff and we consult on it. Your support means we have no sponsors and can speak the unmitigated truth as we see it on this show. Check out the show notes and escapethetechnocracy.com. Hello, everyone. This is Gabriel Custodiet. What you're about to hear is my two interviews that I have done with Doug Casey. And the first interview is episode 51 of the show, and the second one is episode 88. I enjoyed Doug Casey quite a lot, as you'll hear from my original introduction of him, and I thought it would be great to bundle these together, especially since I'm about to interview him again, and also to remaster the audio. So I hope you appreciate this. I'm going back into my archives now and bringing some of these back to the forefront because I've done some good work, and unfortunately the way podcasts work is it gets buried pretty quickly. So I'm trying to bring to the forefront some of my favorite conversations. So please enjoy my two conversations with Doug Casey, which come from episode 51, and after that from episode 88. Thank you. Welcome to the Watchman Privacy Podcast. I'm Gabriel Custodiet. I'm very pleased to share with you an interview with one of the most foundational thinkers in my current education, and that is Doug Casey. Who is Doug Casey? Well, he's many things. He earned his wealth early on and thus has not had to define himself by an occupation throughout much of his life. He's thus had a chance to be a fabulous educator and actor on the world stage. He is an investor and has been throughout his life. He is an anarchist philosopher and one of the most compelling out there. He came to prominence partly for the publication of International Man in 1979, which was one of the first books on offshoring not just finance but oneself via residency and multiple citizenships. He has written a number of books since then. My favorite is Politically Incorrect, Volume 1, which gives a good overview of his carefully surmised thoughts on the world. I also tend to recommend his book, Crisis Investing, for the rest of the 90s. And then we get to his novels. He's written 3 novels so far in the 7-book High Ground series, where he combines his life experience into a young protagonist who takes on various unfairly besmirched occupations: speculator, drug lord, assassin, terrorist, etc. And in doing so exposes the corrupt morality that the average person exhibits on a daily basis. Above all, Doug Casey is thoughtful, especially about morality, and his contrarian thoughtfulness is not to be dismissed. I hope you enjoy this brief conversation. I strived to ask him questions I've never heard him address before, and I encourage you to pick up some of his books. Welcome to the Watchman Privacy Podcast. I'm very pleased to be joined by Doug Casey. Doug Casey, welcome to the Watchman Privacy Podcast. How are you doing?
Well, very well, Gabriel. It's nice to talk to you. I'm still in the U.S., and shortly I'll be back in South America. I don't know if I'm breaking any rule of privacy disclosing that to you on the air or not. I guess I am.
Maybe you are, but we can live with that. I want to ask a privacy question, since I argue that that privacy is the first line of defense for freedom and individualism. You know, what is individualism but the fact that when we arrive in this world as autonomous beings, we're separate from everything else. We have access to our private minds, and that's the standpoint that everyone begins with. And so pursuing privacy is nothing less than protecting the individual. You've said in the past that, well, privacy, the word privacy, is basically a kind of a politically correct term, and that we should use something else, maybe secrecy, to be more honest and accurate. I know that, the power of language is something you often discuss, as does Orwell and, politics in the English language. It can really change your view of reality. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about this term privacy. Well, why do you see it as a politically correct term, if you do?
Well, in the old days, the before times, if you would, there used to be such a thing as Swiss bank secrecy. It wasn't called Swiss bank privacy. Well, it doesn't exist anyway anymore. It's gone. It was Swiss bank secrecy, and it was acknowledged as such, and it was a good thing. But as the world has degraded, and I think it has in important ways over the last couple of generations, nobody says Swiss bank secrecy anymore, because that that implies that you've got something to hide, that you're doing something naughty, that you've got to keep out of public sight. That's not the case at all, actually. It's like saying you have bathroom secrecy. Okay. Well, that's the same as bathroom privacy. But the connotations of these things have changed because the left, in other words, people that believe in statism and collectivism, they pretty well control the language and the meaning of words at this point. So,
Yeah, fair enough. Whatever we want to call it, it's it's on its death throes. Unfortunately, that's what we're trying to combat with this brand. But we do think about this holistically, broadly. That's why I'm grateful to talk to people such as yourself to give us some ideas of privacy in the context of freedom and internationally as well.
yep, no, you're absolutely right. It's the people in back of this that are pushing it are people that belong to these supranational organizations like the World Economic Forum and the Bohemian Grove and the Bilderberg Group. I hate to even throw these terms out because it makes you sound like a conspiratorialist, but birds of a feather do flock together. And the type of people that are invited to these things and go to it all share the same philosophical outlook on the world. And it's basically one that boils down to that the righteous people against the plebs. And the plebs, the hoi polloi, the capita they just don't count. So they need to be bossed around and told what to do. And it's dangerous for them to have, well, forget about secrecy, to have privacy. They've got to be an open book. Well, of course, they already do read everything, the NSA and the rest of these people. So privacy really is a dead duck. It's funny. Who's that chap that Larry Ellison that founded Oracle? And I remember, it must have been it was a long time ago, like 20 or 25 years ago. I read a quote from him that said, "Forget about privacy; it doesn't exist." And that was true, as he said it, just, a quarter century ago. And now it's a total dead duck. So it's heroic on your part to try to keep the flame burning, as it were.
Well, thank you. And I do think that part of the narrative that privacy is dead is a little bit of a psyop. I think that we do have tools at our disposal. I tell people keep using the cache. You can still use that. Use the Tor browser. We have privacy cryptocurrencies. There are some options. We just have to keep fighting the fight. I'm not interested in giving up. Doug, when you mentioned the kind of the controlling people out there in the world, obviously these are many of the enemies of privacy. I've talked a lot about psychopaths on this show. I think it's a great episode called Privacy and Psychopaths, where we explain what they are and how they can alter alter history, right? Entirely. And you talk a lot about psychopaths as well. You have them as characters in your High Ground novel series, especially one called Sabina, who you describe perfectly as a psychopath. And I just want to know, do you remember when you first learned about psychopathy and how did that alter your view of the world?
Hmm, that's a good question. It was a gradual thing. I'm not a fan of Scientology, incidentally, but I am a fan of L. Ron Hubbard, who founded Scientology. And he's actually written a lot of things that make a lot of sense about this whole area. So I think that was many years ago, and it first kind of drew my attention to the fact that there are people that have bent minds. In a way, they're moral cripples, psychological cripples. But just because they're crippled in that way doesn't mean that they're not very powerful in other ways. Yeah, it really is it has to do with concepts of good and evil, frankly. Nobody talks about these things. Certainly not evil, because evil is a concept that you hear the word evil and your attention is immediately drawn to some Bible Belt tent preacher who's talking about evil and how Jesus is going to publish it. But I think evil really exists in the world, And these psychopaths are actually drawn to it. I mean, they look at things differently from normal, healthy human beings.
I think people should read your books and see psychopaths as they operate. There have been studies where psychopathic people their brains literally do not respond the same to emotional words. They've done studies where they will shock people lightly, and there's kind of a timer. They know the shock is coming. Psychopathic people have no tension, whatever, building up to that. Normal people do have tension. They have different, their brains are wired differently. They commit 50 times the amount of serious crimes as regular people. And when they're in positions of power, they can make the tough decisions, right, to bomb a country with no problem at all, because they literally do not have a conscience. They do not have the capacity for a conscience. That's it's a big topic. Doug Casey's one person talking about that. And in these books, it's for this reason that Charles Knight is a world traveler, right? He's always trying to stay ahead of these people who are after him. And I wanted to ask a classic question for you, Doug Casey, about internationalization. You've been to, I don't know, 175 countries, lived in at least a dozen. You've talked in recent years about places like Argentina, Uruguay. You're in the U.S. right now. You've said publicly, and it's fairly pleasant. In the U.S., you have cheap utilities. You have Amazon, which is delivering things to your door. And my question is, maybe this is not a fair question. Despite your many criticisms and valid criticisms of the U.S., you haven't, to my knowledge, renounced your U.S. citizenship. Some people, kind of following your advice, might, to escape the U.S. tax net, which requires giving up U.S. citizenship to avoid things like extradition, they might think about renouncing their U.S. citizenship. I wonder if you've thought about that and why you did or did not act on it.
I've thought about it a lot over the years, and if I've been smart, it's a question of the shoemaker's children. I should have discarded my U.S. citizenship years ago and become a Canadian, which I could have, or become a New Zealander, which I could have, but didn't. I had family reasons that are irrelevant to anybody else, why I didn't. But now, of course, I can. Back in the before times, you could renounce your U.S. citizenship fairly quickly and fairly easily and without any direct cost. You simply did it. But now, of course, well, just to have the interview and all this type of thing costs you $2,500, and which isn't a big barrier. The big barrier is the tax burden they impose upon you. They exact capital gains taxes on any appreciated assets that you have when you get out of their tax web. It's costly to get rid of your citizenship at this point, but there are a lot of advantages to it. Some disadvantages. I mean, a close friend of mine who's quite wealthy renounced his citizenship a few years ago. Part of the deal is you have to stay out of the U.S. for a year after you renounce it. And it depends on what kind of a passport you have, whether you have visa-free travel, as you would if you had a British or Canadian or Irish or one of those passports, where you get visa-free travel. And you're treated just like any other foreign citizen at that point. But then, most people that get second passports are getting them from places like St. Kitts or Dominica. And there you have to get a visa in order to come back to the U.S. Or for that matter, they're changing this now so that even you can't get to Europe. You can't get to the Schengen countries without a visa, applying for a visa, which may or may not be granted depending on how much they dislike these purchased passports. So, the only advantage to having a U.S. passport at this time is it's easy to get into the U.S. and it's easy to get into certain other countries. But the world is changing. So, I think that a U.S. passport at this point is more of a liability than an asset. It used to be considered a great asset. Now it's actually a liability.
Fair enough. You're right. They've made it very difficult with many inconveniences to actually even renounce your U.S. citizenship. So, Doug, I wanted to propose a meta-narrative to you explaining the decline in the last 100 years of the West. And it's a meta-narrative of the decline of masculinity. I know that you and Matt Smith have touched on this, but I want to propose an elevation of its importance. So, of course, we have meta-narratives over the last 100 years, the creation of the Federal Reserve, central banking, the rise of the welfare state, big government. We could talk about the rise of psychopaths, centralization, right? You can't escape borders now because of modern transportation, the rise of big pharma, nationalism, consumerism, modern monetary theory. But I want to propose the decline of masculinity and the rise of a female-centric social order. And this is a phrase from Rollo Tomasi. And here's my idea. So another thing that happened around 1916 is that women in the US get the right to vote. And you have first wave feminism. And today, every woman in the West is feminist, right? In other words, they see women as needing to do the exact same things as men. Even conservative or traditional women who are on talk shows, arguing, running for office, that's precisely what a feminist would do. And so I think feminism, according to this theory, it might be the most consequential idea of the 20th century, right? It says that men and women are the same, maybe some different plumbing, but otherwise they're the same. Throughout history, men and women have never been treated as anything alike. They've not been friends. They've not worked together. They've not done the same things. Women have not been allowed into politics, despite myriad opportunities for them to do so. They've not had leadership roles. But today we have science that helps us to explain certain things, right? Testosterone gives men a fundamentally different experience of reality. It makes men more likely to defend something they believe in, to be interested in concepts of truth and freedom and meritocracy, precisely because they escape more often than women from the collective, right? They're adventurous, building, and entrepreneurial. And women who are more estrogenic tend to be more relativistic, right? In the tribal days, they had to change on a dime when the bad guys came and killed the good guys who were previously their husbands. They're more collectivist. We know that women, by and large, vote more left-wing. They're more coddling, supportive of the welfare state and the warfare state, actually, interestingly enough. Women have almost never been in leadership roles until now. Women tend to be more narcissistic than men, precisely because between the ages of 16 and 26, they're desired by half the population. Of course, anybody would be narcissistic if this was the case. And so what I want to suggest is that the men today, obviously there are more women in power, and the men today who are in power have become feminized and are also so dazed by this idea that men and women should be doing the same things. Wokeism, which dominates our institution, can be summarized as a somewhat erratic philosophy of a female worldview. And so, it could very well be, in conclusion, that all of the problems we have faced since around 1910 stem from the fact that we are increasingly live in a society that is following the female view of how a society should run, and that any other explanations are secondary to this first cause. Sorry to go on for a minute like that, but I'm curious your thoughts on that observation.
That is a superb summary, Gabriel. Excellent summary of what's been going on. And of course, you can see this all over the world. I wonder if you have to do a survey of this, actually, to see whether or not more than half of the world's political leaders are females at this point. They may well be more than half. And insofar, certainly in Europe, the men that are running countries are important. They're very feminized men. They're like girly boy men. They're like nothing, nobodies. They get pushed around. Well, head of the European Union is that woman, Ursula von der Leyen, who I describe as Ursula, she-wolf of the SS. It does seem like women have taken over the world. And of course, it's fashionable now, not only to be ultra-feminist, but to be actively anti-male. So, there's something going on here. And the question is, can this mass psychological aberration, and that's the way I see it, that's going on, which you've described very well, can that overturn 200,000 or 300,000 years of genetic history since physically modern humans evolved? So I don't know. It seems like that's one of the elements that are giving rise to the mass chaos that we see in the world today. It's an overturning of not just the way things are done economically or politically, but at this point, genetically. And of course, one indication of this is all these people having sex changes and imposing them on their children, for that matter. So, yeah, you're right. It's part of the big picture, which is not very pretty.
Right. And on the one hand, to respond, I would say that no, we cannot overturn thousands of years of human development. However, in the last 70 years, Doug, the average level of testosterone among men in the West has decreased by 50%.
In the West, or if that would also be true in backward countries, Africa or the Orient, for that matter.
That's a good question. I don't know. The statistic I read was in the West, but
Yeah.
a lot of it has to do, of course, with the chemicals we're using, the plastics we're using. There's a great book called Estrogeneration, where this doctor kind of talks about all the things that are estrogenic in the environment that is part of this. But there are, of course, other things at work as well.
Yeah, well, that would make sense why it would be mainly in the West, because it's people in the advanced West that are more exposed to all of those things. There was a book that Robert Heinlein wrote, a long time ago, called Farnham's Freehold. And what he projected, and I'm a big fan of Heinlein as a sci-fi writer. I read a lot of sci-fi, or I used to read a lot, less now. He projected in that book that, how far in the future would this have been? 500 years, 1,000 years, doesn't matter, but not the far distant future, that that Africa has colonized the U.S. and taken over all of North America. Was what you just were talking about instrumental in that? I don't know what was on Heinlein's mind, but yeah, we're gonna see a lot of changes one way or another in the next decade and maybe beyond.
And of course, we have China, who is behaving, we could say, in a more masculine way, right? They have made it illegal to portray feminized on TV. So I do think that, of course, if the West gives in to the feminine imperative, it's going to be destroyed by the masculine imperative. There's a reason why there's no societies in history that are women led for sheer self defense reasons. But kind of on this topic, Doug, going back to self improvement, for those who are trying to become, let's say, a Renaissance man, an all around man, what is the area of development that you find most men are lacking refinement in your time observing, traveling around the world?
Well, that's an interesting question. I pointed out in the past that there are the three most important verbs in, I think, any language are be, do, and have. And here in the West, when we emphasize a verb, it tends to be have. I have a nice car. I have a great house. I have a pretty girlfriend. I have a lot of money. But that's fine. That's wonderful. But, having those things is kind of incidental and really ephemeral and not very important compared to the other things: have, do. Certainly in a free market world, you'd only have things because you do things, are able to produce things. It seems to me the world is being more oriented towards passive consumption as opposed to doing, which is active production and creating. And it's by doing things, incidentally, that you can be something. In other words, you can't have a Renaissance man. That's not something you have. You can't even do that. You can do some things a Renaissance man would do. You have to be a Renaissance man. So the problem I think we have is an overemphasis on the wrong verbs. The have is really important. The do, people are doing a lot less, and therefore they are be much, much less than they should. I don't doubt that in the future, a lot of people, and the powers that be would, I think, like this, are going to live in haptic suits and just play fully immersive games all day, maybe die at their terminals or something like that, and not be a bother while they're collecting their annual guaranteed income and living in a cubicle that's assigned to them. I mean, science fiction is the best predictor, I think, of what's going to happen. Certainly not think tanks that try to figure out what's going to happen.
I think that's a no. I think that's a very good point and a very good metaphor to describe it. That men, as one philosopher said, women simply are a man must become, and it's in the act of doing something, getting up from the computer, that men, like literally, that's one reason why testosterone is dropped, is because men are not out there in the sun. Vitamin D important for testosterone, doing things, physical work, exercising the muscle, also something that builds testosterone. You're right. A Renaissance man, he must be out there doing things on a daily basis. I'm respectful of your time here, Doug. I do want to ask you a question I've been meaning to ask you. You've written a number of books, the High Ground novel series, trying to correct some besmirched occupations. You have speculator, drug lord, assassin so far. I'm curious about assassin. So it's fictional, but you do philosophically explore the validity of assassination as a morally correct thing to do in certain cases. I'm wondering if you've gotten any backlash, any maybe particularly difficult border crossings or anything for writing that book and titling it brazenly Assassin.
No, actually, I'm very happy to report that I haven't as yet. But I also know that in the mass surveillance world that we live in, where there are literally at this point, billions of cameras everywhere that can be accessed, and with the bad guys with the bad guys having artificial intelligence now, they can pick up keywords in conversations that are broadcast, and for that matter, conversations on your cell phone, or for that matter, conversations that you might have when your computer's open and you don't think you're talking to anybody electronically. It's increasingly dangerous to say things that run counter to what the bad guys want to hear. But we don't give a damn, frankly. And the next novel, which we're working on, is called Terrorist. That's supposed to be a real no-no. I have a lot of theories and thoughts about terrorism as a method of warfare. And
It's what America was founded on, right?
well, I'm a freedom fighter. You're a rebel. He's a terrorist. So absolutely correct. It's once again, it's a question of how you use words. I mean, you call anybody like an ordinary garden variety rotary going Republican are actually being called terrorists now by the powers that be. And of course, after we do terrorists, which will be next, the next one will be warlord, which I'll go into a hobby of mine for many years, trying to radically reform backward third world countries. And our hero, Charles Knight, will take, I'm not sure if he's going to go back to Gondwana and do it there, or whether he'll pick a really backward country in the South Pacific and turn it from a shithole into Singapore on steroids. And then after that, Antichrist, where I can, do my thing on religion. But, and then the last one's going to be called Apocalypse, where kind of the current world comes to an end, but not in the way the bad guys are hoping. So it's a great. I hope you agree. It's a great series of novels that nobody's done anything like this, to my knowledge, since Rand did Atlas Shrugged. But this is a series of 7 novels, so I hope your listeners don't fall too far behind in them. Pick up the first one, Speculator, which is, I think, a good entrance point.
Well, they're fabulously educational and entertaining along the way. You uncover or you explain in entire paragraphs sometimes some of the way the world works as you see it, right? Drug Lord 2017. You talk about pharmaceutical companies and how they're in bed with the government. Just incredibly informative in addition to being entertaining. I've been waiting for the sequel to Assassin that came out in 2020. I was hoping maybe it would be 1 year. Now it's been 2 years, and now you've said that we're looking at 2023. I know it's excruciating to write fiction. It's really difficult. When can we expect the next one, though?
Let's hope if we talk a year from now, it'll be out.
All right, Doug Casey, thank you so much for joining us on the Watchman Privacy podcast.
Thanks, Gabriel. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I'm very pleased to bring back to the Watchman Privacy podcast Doug Casey. He needs really no introduction. Definitely go back and listen to that first episode if you have any doubts. Doug, welcome back to the show. How are you doing today?
Good, Gabriel. Thanks. It's nice to be here with you.
Well, Doug, I know you like getting into the meat of things, so I figured we'll just start with an easy question, which is one I've been thinking of, which is where do morals come from? And so I was reading a book on Ross Ulbricht, the creator of the Silk Road 2.0, and the author of this book was, I would say, a relativist because they said something about Ross Ulbricht. They were trying to understand this strong libertarian kind of anarchist person throughout the book, and they said at one point that his values were being able to do what you want as long as you don't harm someone else. And then the author defined these as libertarian values. And, I think some of us might ask, like, how could anyone have a disagreement with those particular values, much less kind of try to define them as these offshoot of moral values? And my question for you is, how do you know that the non-aggression principle is the correct moral principle?
All right. Where shall we start on this? Let's look at the Abrahamic religions. The golden rule: do unto others as you'd like them to do unto you. Or should it be, don't do unto others what you wouldn't have them do unto you? Of course, in today's U.S., ruled by the military-industrial complex, morality, ethics don't fit into this at all. And they've perverted the golden rule into do unto others, but do it first. When you make laws telling people what to do, what they must do, you have to enforce these laws. And it's much better just to live and let live. The fewer the laws, the better, is what I'm trying to say, because you don't want to have an apparatus to enforce these laws. Right now in the United States, and maybe I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I'll get back to the question you asked. Thousands of laws, hundreds of thousands of laws that prescribe everything that you must do and must not do. And they say ignorance of the law is no excuse, but that's manifestly ridiculous. Nobody can know what these laws are, on top of the fact that interpreting them, nobody knows what they mean. And some people say, well, how about the 10 Commandments? We can get by following the 10 Commandments. Well, I suppose so. But in the Bible, I believe there are 3 variations of the 10 Commandments. That and the Jews, the Catholics, and the Protestants all have their own variations of the 10 Commandments and what they mean. And frankly, I'm pretty familiar with the Bible, but I don't believe that I could reel off the 10 Commandments now. And I think very few people could. It's too many things to remember. Primitive people, when they're counting, tend to say 2, 3, many. 10 is way too many things to remember. As far as what laws should be the basis of ethics, and we can talk about the difference between morality and ethics, which I think is kind of interesting. I think there are only 2. They've been formulated best by my friend Rick Mayberry. Number 1, do all that you say you're going to do. And number 2, don't impinge on other people or their property. Well, that's pretty simple. And they're actually rather intuitive. A kindergarten kid can understand that. I'd go even further than that. I'll mention Aleister Crowley, which a lot of people hate because he certainly had his dark side. But I liked what he said when he formulated what he said. The whole of the law shall be do as thou wilt. That's basically what most people do. They do what they want to do. But he should have added a clause after that. But be prepared to accept the consequences. Because anything you do, you can do anything you want. You can go out and commit murder, raping, theft, anything. I mean, what's going to stop you from doing those things? But be prepared to accept the consequences and think things out. And that's all about personal responsibility. So the basis of all these things come from personal responsibility and personal ethics.
Well, it's a good start, and I do think that maybe we overthink this question because I was talking to one of your unlikely feuds from the Ayn Rand Institute in my last episode, and he simply said that if people are being rational and truly rational, they're all going to have the same simple ethics, which is kind of the ethics that or the morals that we've described. And maybe this is a different way of asking the question, Doug, which is why not just a will to power? Clearly, it's in our nature to fight and to conquer, and may the best man win. And you're a scholar of Roman history. Would the world have been better if the Romans had let all of these tribes and barbarians, if they had left them alone and not expanded and dominated? Imposing one's will on the world is what has defined the world up to this point. Why not just accept that and try to be the better ruler when you are in charge yourself?
Yeah, it's a real problem with humans. This will to power is part of our nature, and it comes out most virulent form when people form themselves into states, into governments. That's where it really evidences itself and where it's really, really dangerous. My feeling is that in a civil society, people tend to get along pretty well. They exchange as opposed to steal. It's like when you go to a restaurant. You don't need a cop in a restaurant keeping an eye on everybody. People tend to behave. My belief is that most of the problems that we have today are generated directly and indirectly by the institution of government, by the institution of the state. Incidentally, just a side tangent, you mentioned the Ayn Rand Institute, and I'm a big fan of Ayn Rand, or Ayn Rand, whichever you prefer, I guess. But I think there are two outfits that promote her ideas. One is the Ayn Rand Institute, and the other one is the Atlas Society. I generally prefer the Atlas Society because they tend to be populated by more mellow and reasonable people. Trouble with Randites is that they're often very dogmatic, and that tends to turn her ideas into something of a secular religion.
Let me combine a few things then so far, which is that one of the discrepancies between, let's say, you and Ayn Rand will be that you're an anarchist. Ayn Rand, I think it's fair to say, despised anarchists because she saw the need for a very limited government. And some people will say that if you mention anarchy and you explain it as cogently as you can, they'll say, well, the first thing I've heard a lot of people say is, look, countries, let's say like China, seem clearly to have some kind of global ambition. And let's say if the US government were to disband, wouldn't another powerful country and one with non-Western values just eventually come and colonize all these various tribes with all of the force of their centralized government and their powerfully focused military?
Not terribly seriously, because sure, there are other big countries out there run by the kind of people that get into government. And I may have pointed this out in the past, but I'll point it out again. It's that the type of people that get into government aren't the best and the brightest, as they'd like to have you believe. They're actually poorest and the worst type of people. Got two kinds of people. People that want to control the material world and move stuff around and atoms around. And then there are people that are much more interested in controlling other people. And those are basically criminal personalities, and they're drawn to government. The problem, once again, gets back to government itself. And Ayn Rand, it's true. She really disliked anarchists, and she disliked libertarians. I think she disliked libertarians mainly because at that time they were advocating pot smoking, and she was a social conservative, and that kind of rubbed her the wrong way. Look, I like Ayn Rand's ideas, and her basic philosophy, I think, is great, and her sense of life is great. believe it or not, my big problem with Ayn Rand is she didn't go far enough. And she didn't seem to recognize that government as an institution is a cancer. So I could live happily enough, believe me, in a society where you had a government and the government did nothing more than protect you from force, which is what Rand very logically put forward. If you're going to have, what's government? Government is pure force, quite correct. So the purpose of a government is to protect you from other people initiating force. What's that imply? An army for force outside of the bailiwick of the government, police inside the bailiwick, and a court system to allow you to adjudicate disputes without resorting to force. That's fine. I mean, that's a night watchman type government. I could live with that. But as I mentioned before, problem is the kind of people that are drawn to government are almost necessarily criminal, busybody personalities. And they always corrupt government to their own means, and it always ends up badly. And that's the argument for anarchism. And I'm afraid Rand didn't consider that or didn't recognize it. But that's the only dispute I have with Rand.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I brought up that exact point with Huron Brook in my last episode, that if you allow a monopoly on force to enter, it will eventually expand. And he had a few interesting thoughts on it. I think he's just more optimistic about human nature. You know, Doug, you've written a series of books, the High Ground novels, which have been excellent at, like Ayn Rand, not just having interesting ideas that are unusual these days, but to show them in practice, which is, I think, incredibly useful. And so I know you've been thinking about a lot of the practical application of your ideas. And I want to ask you about, again, going back to this Silk Road, this dark net marketplace where you could buy all kinds of things for Bitcoin, which was and it was closed down when Ross Ulbricht was captured several years ago in San Francisco. Now, even in the Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht, he had very strong principles, and he drew the line. He would not allow certain things on the platform. I think he drew the line at like assassination, various hard drugs that you might say rob you of your free will. I'm just wondering if you were running a marketplace like this, where would you draw the line of things that you would not allow on your marketplace, if at all?
One rule that I try to stick by is stay away from nasty and bad people. Well, now we can get into what is a bad person. But in today's world, things that are manifestly illegal, repugnant to most people, they draw the wrong kind of characters. So I can understand Ross doing that. And incidentally, as you probably know, Gabriel, I'm a big supporter of Ross. If I was president, before I resigned, I would, among other things, pardon Ross Ulbricht because he was railroaded. And it's absolutely criminal what they've done.
Absolutely, yes.
If I ran Silk Road, is there anything that I would prohibit? Well, maybe if you're just setting up a platform that people pay to use. I mean, do I want to impose my personal predilections on other people that are trading voluntarily? Probably not. There's things that I might not approve of at all. But am I going to be the sole arbiter? Well, I guess I could be if I owned the platform.
Right.
I'm actually not sure what the answer to that question would be.
It's funny to think about because Ross Ulbricht, I've been reading a lot of books on him. He spent many years thinking through these ideas and then implementing them, and where he would draw the line and how far he was willing to go with his ideals. And that's a very, very interesting person for sure. And one who, by the way, could not talk to any other human being about these topics for the most part.
Yeah, I'm a friend of his mother, actually. He didn't talk to other humans about that because he didn't like to talk to them, or he was...
So he did talk to the people online who he had met completely virtually, his admins who he trusted. So he could bounce ideas off of them, but none of the people in his real life, so to speak, except for one girlfriend who he regretted telling this about, but he didn't talk to her about many of these ideas.
Well, it's too bad what happened to her. It's like when you engage in anything that is illegal. And of course, most things that are illegal are stupid. They're just manufactured illegalities that have nothing to do with basic ethics or basic morality. But still, you have to recognize in the world we live in, if you do things that are illegal, there are going to be operatives of the state. They're going to be out there hunting you. So in Ross's case, if he made a bunch of money, which I guess he did, the best thing to do is to call it quits and walk away while you've got the money.
Well, the bag could have doubled the next day, Doug. But on that topic of investing, thinking about investing, I've been meaning to ask somebody this kind of question, which is it moral to invest in military or warring companies? And here's my basic layout of the argument, Doug, or my analysis of it. Okay, so you recognize that there's always going to be war, and why not profit personally on that fact so that you can take that money and you can use it for your own endeavors personally to, let's say, you could even use it to oppose war in your own way. However, when you buy stocks in that quote unquote defense company, you are participating in driving up the price, which consequently enriches the biggest shareholders who are probably not of the same moral values as you. And those people will become enriched and they will use that to do the things that you don't agree with. So, what have I missed in that analysis?
That's a very good analysis. And I appreciate the fact that you put defense in quotation marks because they're not defense companies, actually. They're not defending anything. If anything, they're provoking more wars. Well, what to do about owning those kind of stocks? In today's world, if you make that argument, okay, you can't own military/war making companies. Well, but maybe you can't own pharmaceutical companies because they're all unbelievably hooked up with the government. I mean, it's not just this recent COVID hysteria that they've been complicit in, but all kinds of other things, same kind of people in the big pharma companies. In fact, almost all of the publicly traded companies out there are run by sociopaths. So does that mean that you shouldn't play in the stock market because a bunch of criminals own those stocks? I think the only argument you could make along those lines is you may not want to capitalize a war company. In other words, when it's being founded, supply capital. After it's publicly traded, the stock doesn't know who owns it and really doesn't care. And yes, if you buy the stock, it'll marginally drive the price up. Right. But I don't want to cut off my nose to spite my face if I see a good opportunity. In fact, if the opportunity presented itself, I mean, maybe I'd want to start a private military company, a mercenary group, of which there are a lot in the world today, not just the Wagner Group, which is the Russians. Look, when I talk about morality and ethics, that doesn't mean that I'm in any way interested in being a Puritan or a blue nose. Like I said, the whole of the law should be do as thou wilt, but be prepared to accept the consequences. The consequences might be legal from horrible people that impose upon you, but the biggest consequences are having to live with yourself. So I don't have a problem with owning the shares of Raytheon if I think they're going higher. I wouldn't have any problem with founding a private military company, quite frankly. Should you join the military? If you're drafted, because they may send you off to kill some perfectly innocent person. It's a question of practicality that should not conflict with ethics either.
You've said, I think this comes from Totally Incorrect, where you talk about the justice system in the US. And this maybe returns to Ross Ulbricht, where you say that the proper role of a jury, you're talking about the proper role of a jury. You say, quote, the jury's proper and historical function is not to enforce laws, but to stand as the final arbiter of law, and thus to protect people from tyranny. In other words, judging the law as well as the facts of a case.
Yes.
They have a special term for this, I think, these days, where you're basically considered to be sabotaging the legal system by behaving like that. But I wonder if you could just briefly enlighten people about this situation.
Yeah. What you're talking about, I think, is whenever anybody is accused of a crime and they have a jury trial, and of course, in today's United States, you can be accused of a crime, and have a right to a jury trial, but the actual number is like 97 or 98% of all criminal cases aren't tried. They're plea bargained, where the prosecutor says, I can throw the book at you and you can get 150 years and $1 million fine. Or because he's looking for a win so he can move up the ladder, the political ladder, I'll give you 5 years and I'll suspend 3 of them. And that's how most cases go down today. But if we had a proper legal system in this country, almost all trials would be jury trials, where people would decide not on just whether he broke the law or not. Frankly, since most laws are so stupid, I really don't care if somebody broke the law. I'm more interested in first determining whether the law is ethical and reasonable. And if it's not, the jury should throw it out. But that's called jury nullification. You cannot advocate for it. It's very dangerous. It used to be part of our system, but it's been quashed. Look, I've never been on a jury because most jury trials they're just bullshit things. And I didn't want to, you got to spend your day in a government office being qualified. I never passed the voir dire process anyway, quite frankly. But so I've never been on a jury, but
And of course, we know that it's very dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. You have an upcoming book called, I believe this one is Terrorist, where you're reevaluating certain besmirched occupations. Of course, the founding fathers in the U.S. would have been considered terrorists by any reasonable definition. So a terrorist is not per se a bad thing.
well, that is one of the nice things about being paid to write books, is that it gives you the opportunity to research and think about lots of interesting topics. And terrorism, both its philosophical components, but its practical components, are actually very interesting. My co-author, John Hunt, and I are going to dig into a lot of these things. And of course, a lot of this is going to revolve around, is terrorism a good thing or a bad thing? And of course, everybody says, no, it's a bad thing. Well, I'm a freedom fighter. You're a rebel. He's a terrorist, is the way this thing comes down. Yeah, I hope we get that book done in the next year, but no guarantees. I've got to do this Renaissance man book first, I think. And then after Terrorist, when Charles, our hero, is accused of being a terrorist and being hunted like Carlos the Jackal, that leads us to our next book, where the best place to hide if you're accused of, God forbid, being a terrorist is in a war zone. So he goes back to Gondwana, shithole African country, where he made his first fortune in the mining business, and becomes a warlord, which is also supposed to be a horrible thing. Charles shows that a warlord can be a good thing. Anyway, when are we going to do it? It's a good question. There's not enough hours in the day.
This has been Doug Casey. I definitely encourage you to go back and read books like Totally Incorrect and his High Ground novel series, where he gets into a lot more depth. And I would encourage people to certainly follow up with your work there. And you have a great newsletter on internationalman.com. I'll give you the final words, Doug.
Well, I don't know what I can add to that, Gabriel. It's certainly an excellent and a welcome endorsement on your part, because so many people do podcasts these days. Everybody and his dog does a podcast. The type of questions that you ask, I hope you get a huge audience just because you examine things. So let me return your compliment with a counter compliment. So it's a pleasure talking to you.
Certainly a pleasure. I think the kind of things that I do talk about ensure that I will not get a huge audience, thanks to the YouTube gods. But we'll do what we can. So thank you again, Doug.
Further proof we live on a prison planet. Thanks, Gabriel.
Hey, thanks for listening. I could really use your help real quick. If you could share this episode with someone, engage with me, leave a review anywhere, this helps me to break the technocratic shadow banning that is happening with my brand. And of course, if you really want to escape the technocracy, go to escapethetechnocracy.com. Privacy tutorial series, books, newsletters, consulting, and of course, you can leave a donation. Thank you very much.